Good morning and welcome to this lecture by Dr. David Köpsel on scientific integrity in research and publication. My name is Susanna Kolb and I am the coordinator of the academic writing program at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. I would like to welcome Dr. David Köpsel, as well as our students and the audience watching this event live. Today's talk was organized as part of a workshop on writing for publishing purposes directed at UNAM postgraduate students. Therefore, after the lecture, I will read out questions from our workshop students to talk about real-life situations in which ethical issues can emerge in the context of academia. Before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce our guest. Dr. David Köpsel is a philosopher, entrepreneur, author, attorney, and educator whose recent research focuses on the nexus of science, technology, ethics, and public policy. Professor Köpsel has been a tenured associate professor of philosophy at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, visiting professor at the Institute of Philosophical Research, and at the Office of Graduate Studies at UNAM. In addition, he was Director of Research and Strategic Initiatives of the National Bioethics Commission in Mexico and advisor to the director of UAM Xochimilco. Welcome, David, and I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and thank you for the German pronunciation of my name. It's the only time it's ever been said properly. So I want to thank you again for having me back to the class. It's always a pleasure to speak to your students about issues of primarily of publishing. But I wanted to encourage you, there is a book that was published by CONACYT, which is in Spanish, which I co-wrote with Dr. Luis de Chavez of Conbioética. You can get this for free. It has the second part of this book has today's materials in it, and it really does frame. And if you're interested in the English version, there's an English version too from Springer. The title of the book is Scientific Integrity and Research Ethics: An Approach from the Ethos of Science. So I've been teaching about publishing and research ethics for, I guess, 20 years now. And ever since I started teaching the course with my good colleague, David Triggle in Buffalo, New York, we've focused really on using this, what we call the ethos of science, as the basis for the lesson. And there's a reason for that. And I want to now share my screen if I'm able to. So I can start to walk you through what that means, the ethos of science. So this notion of the ethos of science comes from the work of Robert Merton, who is a sociologist of science. And he was interested really in how it is that scientific institutions exist, what makes them function, what are the values that are inherent in it. And we felt, Dr. Triggle and actually Dr. Hull as well, who helped come up with many of these lessons as well, we felt that presenting to scientists reasons why you should do things that are ethical, not necessarily based upon philosophical ethics, but rather based upon values that are inherent to science itself, was an approach that would have a more universal appeal. And that makes sense, really, we think, from the point of view of scientists. And Robert Merton's work is really foundational to this lecture and to the cases I'm going to be presenting as well. And his work focused in on 4 fundamental values that he felt make science work as it does. And these include universalism, communalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. So let's go through those values a little bit, because they're really going to provide a lot of guidance for the cases and for the practices that we suggest. So universalism simply means that the objects of science, the things that science studies, are the same everywhere. There's no special corner of the world where science works differently than any other place. In order for science as an institution to work, it really views its objects as being utterly universal, not just here on Earth, but throughout the universe. It seeks to uncover universal truths, and for this to work, We have to expect that the laws of nature and that undergird the truths we're investigating are the same everywhere. Communalism means that, again, for science to work as it does, it's a necessarily communal activity. So while you often pursue your initial research behind closed doors without necessarily sharing to the world what you're doing and how you're investigating or the results you're getting, at some point, you need to share it. For the institutions of science to work properly, you engage with the community, other scientists working in other places on similar things, and then you open up your research to their scrutiny. Disinterestedness, what does that mean? What that means is really that you can't have a vested interest in the result of a particular study. And we'll see again through some stark examples, some cases from history, that if you're too much invested in a particular result, the way you report on your experiments can become skewed intentionally or unintentionally. And then finally, organized skepticism. So scientists have to constantly doubt what they're seeing, what they're reporting. In order for science's institutions to work, you need to remain skeptical. You have to also be skeptical of the things that are held to be most true about your area of research. So even the laws of physics are constantly open to scrutiny, are constantly able to be overturned by some new study or observation. This is what we mean by organized skepticism. Science is a socially constructed institution. There's no, president of science. There's no central authority overlooking it or ensuring that its processes are being engaged with properly. Rather, it's an amorphous group of institutions and individuals operating in different parts of the world, in different languages and different cultural milieus, but that understand that there are these values, that there are these guiding principles that make it work as such. So some have thought maybe we need some sort of universal scientific code, but actually it's a really successful amorphous, disorganized, socially constructed institution without a governing body. It's really I think, one of the greatest examples of how human progress can occur without central authority. So again, there's a number of professional scientific organizations, but there's no central accrediting bodies or there's no membership card to be a scientist, but instead we all seem to be functioning as though we are working together towards a goal, sharing our results, getting together, publishing, and encouraging others in their pursuits. So perhaps the ethos of science that Merton has uncovered, these values that I mentioned before, work in some way to organize us to do what we do successfully. And now, more pertinent to the nature of this talk, I want to talk about 5 broad areas in which scientific integrity can be derived from the ethos of science. So you can really do this on your own. You can apply the ethos to cases that you face in your work to resolve questions before you end up having to take them to professional ethicists like myself for input or resolution. So those 5 areas are research, conduct or misconduct, authorship, conflicts of interest, intellectual property and data, and finally, duties to society. These are the major areas I'll talk about. I'm sure there's plenty of other types of cases that have overlapping natures that overlap several of these categories. or there may be categories I don't discuss. I'm always happy to discuss new cases and new potential categories of scientific integrity breaches. So let's talk about research conduct or misconduct first. The central theme of this section is that researchers should be forthright about the bases for their own work, where it depends, as most research does, on as Newton acknowledged, upon the work of others. So none of us are working in a vacuum. All of us are working within some historical context, and there's always some prior basis or some other basis that we may need to refer to, that we should definitely acknowledge. So what this means in the negative is don't misrepresent data. Don't fail to properly acknowledge sources or methods. Anything that tends to undermine the confidence that an objective peer would have in the research or findings of others, where those actions are known, ought to be avoided merely as a practical matter. So what happens if we fail to abide by this principle? I think we'll see in several of the cases we'll discuss that science itself as an institution suffers. What are those implications? So I like to use this example because nobody expects me to talk about Ptolemy. Ptolemy is an interesting figure. He's very important in the history of astronomy. I was asked to submit a chapter for a book on the ethics of astronomy. And that got me thinking, well, what could possibly go wrong ethically in astronomy research? And actually, the Ptolemy case is pretty helpful. So Ptolemy was, of course, a Greek astronomer, and he was really quite essential to astronomy in that he compiled the very first compendium of astronomical objects, the stars in the sky. One of the first really comprehensive star maps. But it seems likely that this star map borrowed from others' observations, and there is really no attribution to those observations. And although there weren't the institutions of science that Merton has honed in on, and that form the basis for today's lecture, necessarily in effect at the time, there are some significant problems with the fact that Ptolemy may have borrowed from others and didn't attribute. So first of all, usually I open this up for questions, but this is non-Socratic. This is just me lecturing. So I'm going to delve into how it is we know that Ptolemy didn't necessarily do all the observations that account for the stars in the star map. Ptolemy lived at a well-known latitude. The stars in the sky that are visible from a particular latitude are well known. If I go further south, then I won't see certain stars that I'm used to seeing in the north. And if I go in the opposite direction, the opposite is true. So Ptolemy's star map, as it turns out, had stars in it that would not have been visible to him, given what we know about where he lived and where he traveled. It seems that some of the stars that were visible in the star map that he ended up publishing would have only been visible from latitudes further south. And a number of scientists since have worked out that there were observations that were made probably from Egypt or further, a little further south in Saharan Africa. And that Ptolemy probably borrowed these objects and published them in his map to make it more complete, but without attribution. So why is this a problem? Why should you attribute when you are using the work of others in your scientific publications? it's not only ethically wrong to claim another's work as yours, but it poses a problem for science. Again, the ethos of science is disturbed when you fail to attribute. Again, I usually ask my students when I'm lecturing, what could possibly go wrong from Ptolemy's misappropriation of stars he couldn't have observed in his own star map. Well, this, as it turns out, this star map became the basis for people's understanding of the heavens for quite some time. People didn't bother to check and to confirm or to create new star maps. It actually was a map that was used for hundreds of years by, so helicopter in the background. I live near a hospital. So the star map was used for hundreds of years, not only by other scientists, but by navigators. And the assumptions we would make about the latitude of the observer in making Ptolemy's star map could not only lead other scientists astray about where their future observations might be properly made in that star map, but it could actually cause real harm. So what possible harm could come from a bad star map? Again, I usually like to ask people what could go wrong. You know, until the invention of accurate timepieces for navigation, star maps were the primary mechanism for proper navigation of the seas. And if you think you are at one latitude and you're really at another latitude, and the error about your latitude is the result of using Ptolemy's star map and assuming that he observed all those observations at a particular latitude, you might hit a continent when you don't mean to. So this is certainly, you know, the sort of worst case scenario. But for astronomers in doing academic work, believing that observations were made that were not made can also lead to errors. So for instance, the observations that Ptolemy borrowed were probably not contemporaneous, which means that if they were earlier and they now appear to be inaccurate, it's because of what happens to stars over the course of time in the sky. Over the course of time, stars migrate in the sky. And if we don't know the times of those observations, again, astronomers working on publications that rely upon his observations that were possibly actually made hundreds of years earlier could lead to erroneous conclusions about the precession of various stars in the sky. So these are actual, real scientific errors that could creep in because of a misappropriation, besides hitting continents, which is also quite bad. So why do people do this? Why do people fail to attribute or misattribute or claim data as their own? Well, this is a very complex issue, and it's certainly true that there are significant pressures in the academic world that lead people to publish often, well, not often, but sometimes we hope it's not often, sometimes without proper attribution of their sources. There's certainly a mad rush now to have as many publications as possible. I know the environment for graduate students is very different than when I was a graduate student many years ago. And I wasn't expected to have a paper published when I graduated. And now I know that's not the case. Most of you will be expected to be published by the time you graduate. So these pressures can lead people to cut corners, or even worse, to commit fraud. And this has a real impact on science. Another case I wanted to mention that before I talk about some of these cases is one I stumbled across when I was a graduate student, where I was doing a research paper on warfare in ancient Tasmania, or at least in Tasmania before the Tasmanians were extinct. And I had pulled out all the books on the subject from the library, which, as you can imagine, were not many. And I was reading one, and I discovered that it was, well, I felt a weird sense of deja vu. The two books I read were by a gentleman by the name of Bonwick and Davies. So this is now a famous case, but at the time it was unknown. This was in '88, I was doing this. And James Bonwick was an English-born anthropologist, and he was doing actual firsthand anthropological research in Tasmania, doing some interviews with people in Tasmania before they were extinct. I'm going to quickly share something, a different screen. So there, David Davies came along in 1973 and published a book called Aboriginal Tasmanians. And this is the Google, note for Google Books note. It's David Davies' book is now noted to be plagiarized with slight modernization of style from Bonwick's Last of the Tasmanians. So you don't want to be cited that way forever by Google Scholar or Google Books. It was the case. He just copied it more or less word for word. Pretty shameful. I didn't know what to do about it at the time when I realized this was the case. Fortunately, someone else did it for me, somebody in the field of anthropology. It's not just bad for science. And the problem, of course, for science is that somebody reading Davies' book in 1973, who doesn't have a citation to Bonwick's book, which was published while Tasmanians were still alive, would not only not know how Davies got these accounts, but be unable to confirm the sources. So this is a real problem in anthropology. Davies' book should not be relied upon for any science. It was his doctoral dissertation. And it's invalid. It's just invalid. You can't use it. It's no good for science. And it breaks the chain, really, of knowledge that Bonwick's book established. So I get very passionate about that, sorry. Now let me go back to, yes, the presentation. So this still goes on, and I have here in this presentation, I'll give you the link for the presentation, it's public. You can also find the citations in the books I mentioned. It still goes on. People are still using the work of others, or sometimes even making it up wholesale. And you should, if you get a chance, read this excerpt from onlinecolleges.net, 10 academic frauds who had everyone fooled. I usually like to talk, well, when I was in Holland, I used to like to talk about this guy, Diederik Stapel, who actually, he just made up a bunch of data and published based on that. But again, the problem was the failure for science when people break the chain of knowledge and don't give you a way to check, because that's what science does. The communal action of science is to check and recheck and remain skeptical and corroborate and then refine based upon these processes. So you have to be open about your sources, attribute correctly, leave a clear trail, be honest, cooperative, and careful with your data. So being good, it turns out, is good for science. And instead of calling upon the better angels of your nature to be good for being good's sake, which is also nice, I would say, I would suggest that if you care about science, that for it to function properly, you need to be good. So I'll take questions at the end. Please write them down and keep notes. I'm going to move on to authorship now. Authorship is a huge concern for all of us as academics. As I said, it's a major basis of our status as an academic. Your H-index means something to some people. Your ability to reach the audience of scientists around the world through your works of authorship matters for science itself and for your own career. And there's a lot of complications about what counts as being an author. And these complications, it turns out, are becoming problematic in some ways. And I want to offer you some advice and guidance because I get a lot of students who, even now, they reach out to me with questions about, who counts as an author. There are guiding principles, but there are no rules that are set in stone. So it's one that gets negotiated. It's very political. I want to give you some ways to resolve these issues among yourselves before they become problems, which they can become. Now, this no longer looks silly. 10 years ago, when I started talking about these issues, or 20 years ago, a list of authors like this was more of a big deal than it is now. Again, this is from astronomy. Here, the authorship, the co-authorship of all of these authors is probably based upon the fact that they are each of them contributing data sets to a study. And their labs are all doing analytical work on those data sets. They're doing their own observations. And they're all reviewing the data of the other research centers and ensuring that the published claims are consistent with those data sets. Now you can find papers that have hundreds of authors. These large author lists are often the result of international multi-center studies that are becoming more and more common in what we call big data and big science. How does one get named as an author? So this is a perennial question, and it may be because you've secured funding for the study, and it's very common for the director of a laboratory who's secured funding for a study to be named as usually the last author, while the person who's doing the heavy lifting of putting the words on page is the first author, and then there's a bunch of authors in between. But there are other reasons why sometimes people get named as authors, and it may be because of a sense of hierarchy. I've seen this happen in departments, and I know it happens around the world, that the chair of a department or the chair of some program in a department, a director, gets named on a paper because of them being the chair or director of some research department. And that's, as I said, this is also often a very political issue, and it's understandable that people get named based upon political pressures and even customs or cultural inertia that causes people to expect to be named as authors on papers due to some other hierarchy. I want to argue that that is, while it's understandable, it's insufficient for a grant of authorship. You need to have something more, and I want to now give you some tools to make that claim and to argue the case that those people should be doing something more than simply being members of a hierarchy. A good measure really is asking whether the person who is named as an author actually contributed to writing the paper, either through the developing of ideas, that could be enough, doing some critical research and analysis, or the nuts and bolts of stringing the words together in a meaningful way. And I'm not just saying this because I think it's fair, but because there are repercussions, again, for science itself if we don't abide by some of these standards. So mere copy editing doesn't amount to authorship. My wife is a pharmacogenomicist, and she writes in papers and publishes in journals that have much better index factors than philosophy journals. So, you know, my H index could improve significantly if I simply copy edited all her papers and insisted on being named an author. I'm sure she'd do it, but it's just, you know, not because of good academic reasons, but because she loves me. That's not enough to be named as an author. And I would never ask her to do it because it's not enough. You know, I have very little understanding of the field of pharmacogenomics. And if I'm an author of a paper, I should be taking responsibility for what's in that paper in some way, not merely the, you know, the proper grammar or spelling, but rather the substance of the paper. We should be asking whether, without the person to be named, would that paper, as conceived and written, be possible? Some hand in both the conception and realization of the paper is what's necessary for authorship. And also, I would say, some ability to take responsibility. So you must at least be reading the paper. And again, I'm speaking from direct knowledge that some people get named as authors on papers they don't read. So you need to be at least reading it and commenting on it and giving some input in some way, preferably writing parts, but at least reviewing it and providing commentary. Now, the case I like to talk about here is this case, Dr. Huang Woo-suk, number 3 on our top 10 list, is very famous for having written this article that appeared in the journal Science, a nice little journal to get published in. And it was about how he had successfully cloned stem cells. Now, this would be a tremendous breakthrough. And it means that, you know, if you could clone embryonic stem cells, and you could create, you know, an abundance of these that can be used in treatment. As it turns out, this paper has since been retracted. Are you able to see the red bit up here? Again, like the plagiarized note in Google books for David Davies, you don't want to have a paper retracted from Science. Now, here are a number of co-authors, and they span a number of research labs in 1 or 2 continents as well. Dr. Huang Woo-suk, as it turns out, had falsified some of the data that was in that paper. There were at least one figure that was used in the published paper was falsified. And the data then became suspect, and then the publishers retracted the paper. And as it turns out, Huang Woo-suk actually went to jail in South Korea for defrauding the government through the use of falsified data. So there are significant personal repercussions for Huang Woo-suk, but what about all these co-authors? You know, if you are a co-author on a paper that's retracted, how does that reflect on you as a co-author? It's not, I don't think, something you want to have happen. So who is responsible? Who gets the benefit and who gets the blame? If you're going to take the benefit of getting published in a journal like Science, you should be ready to get blamed for any problems with that paper. And all of the people who are co-authors there are now, you know, answerable to what happened. Did they read the paper? Had they agreed with all of it? Did they check the authenticity of the data? Did they check the authenticity of the figures? Now, when you submit papers to Science and Nature and all these big journals now, you actually have to go online and take responsibility for it. But not all journals do that. So that's a pretty good measure, I think. And if you are faced with a question of authorship or co-authorship in a paper, you should be able to make the argument that whoever is being attributed as an author is also taking responsibility and able to accept any blame for any errors in that paper, or worse, any fraud. Okay. Part 3 of my lecture usually deals with conflicts of interest. These are less pertinent to questions of authorship, but if you don't mind, Susanna, I'll go through them very briefly because I think it's good for your students to have some ideas about what goes on in science in general. This goes to the question of disinterestedness, which I raised in the beginning. And it's something you need to keep in mind and I want to give you a very quick introduction of what it means. We often become vested in objects of our study, and we may do so at our peril. The Mertonian ethos of disinterestedness is there to protect us from the perils of becoming overly invested in a particular result. And again, the nature of modern science is such that it creates pressures that may lead us to become overly invested in a particular result instead of being disinterested in the results. And this is illustrated best in conflicts of interest. And this case is a particularly tragic one that I've been discussing for quite some time. Jesse Gelsinger was a teenager who suffered from a genetic disease. It was a monogenic disease called OTC, and what it meant is that his body didn't produce a certain enzyme necessary for the metabolism of fats. And when somebody has one copy of this gene, it's really just a SNP. It's an error in one letter of the genetic code in one gene. And when you have that one SNP, you have to avoid eating animal fats or your organs are affected and eventually you get sick and die. Luckily, you can live your whole life if you just avoid animal fats and be healthy. If you have two copies of the gene, you actually die before you're 18 months old. This was at a time in the 90s when people were getting interested in the field of gene therapy. And the idea was that if you could find a way to just fix that one letter of the code, you could cure the person of a monogenic disease. And people had realized that there's a really neat way to deliver a genetic code to cells, and that is through viruses. Viruses basically do this to survive. They hijack your cells and insert their code and replicate themselves. If you could create a virus that would deliver a fix to the code, then you could cure the person. And this is still a viable area of research, and there are already some gene therapy trials that have proven to be effective. This is a guy named James Wilson. He's sort of the father of modern gene therapy studies. And this is where things get interesting. So he was the head of something called the Institute for Human Gene Therapy, which is a not-for-profit organization. He also was the founder and major stockholder in a company called Genovo, Inc. And he was a faculty member, and he was enticed to be, he was attracted to be a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was given access to laboratories and all the apparatus of science necessary to conduct studies, human subjects trials. University of Pennsylvania was also the host of this Institute for Human Gene Therapy. It was also a stockholder in Genovo, Inc. This is sort of still a model that a lot of people look up to of a private-public partnership that's supposed to, make everybody wealthy. And universities like University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and others are, creating these sorts of entities and relationships because not only does it help them to pay the bills, but it can fund their endowments, and faculty members are no longer tied to just having their income from being faculty members, but they can make money in these private ventures as well. Now that's a simplified version of the relationships. So University of Pennsylvania was obviously very excited about the study of human gene therapy. You know, if it could be successful, it could make, it could not only allow diseases to be cured and lives to be saved, but it could also create a flow of wealth for the university and also make them rather famous. So in order to create this private-public partnership, Penn actually waived some of its own conflict of interest guidelines. It gave exclusive rights to licensed patents from Wilson's lab at Penn to Genovo, which was Wilson's company, as you recall, and Genovo's corporate sponsors, including Biogen. Penn also allowed Wilson to control up to 30% of the stock of Genovo, which was more than the 5% limit ordinarily imposed on other professors. So unfortunately, the human trials, when they started, went terribly wrong when Jesse Gelsinger, he was injected with the genetically modified viruses. It's an adenovirus. And within a few days, he had died because of an immune system revolt, where his organs basically were attacked as though they were enemies of his body. And he died 4 days after the trial began. There's all sorts of bioethical issues we could discuss about this case, and whole seminars could be taught about it. But an FDA investigation found some of these problems. The study was enrolling patients like Gelsinger who were not eligible for the study. He had elevated ammonia levels at the time, but they let it slide. They let him into the study. Part of the problem is that it's a very rare disease, and finding subjects for the study was difficult and time-consuming. And of course, in the potential concerns about stock prices, of course, there are pressures to get results quickly. We're facing similar issues, I might say, right now in the chase for a vaccine for COVID-19, which is something you might have heard about. We're all studying from home and working from home as a result of this pandemic, and there's a great deal of pressure because of the costs involved to get a vaccine done. And if we have a vaccine this year, it will be the fastest such vaccine ever invented. It would be a tremendous problem if those vaccines are not put through the proper trials. As we can see in the case of Jesse Gelsinger, human subjects trials are designed as they are to prevent these kinds of tragedies. They also failed to stop the study after some of the patients developed elevated liver enzymes, fever, and anemia. They had failed to follow the experiment plan in conducting monitoring medical tests on the patients. They had submitted misleading and inaccurate statements in their annual report on the experiments, including claims that there were no significant toxicities experienced by patients. Excuse me a second. And these are just some of the failures of the study. They also failed to warn the patients who were enrolled as subjects for the studies that 2 monkeys used in the experiment in the animal phase, which is necessitated by the Nuremberg conventions, that these animals had to be put to death when they experienced serious side effects. Similar side effects to what Jesse Gelsinger had experienced. So what does this mean? This means that while we are writing, while we are doing our studies, while we are gathering data and reporting on it, we have to be mindful for whether or not we're being sufficiently disinterested. Are we motivated by the goals of science to find the truth, or are we interested in some way that keeps us improperly motivated and potentially motivated by other factors? Again, usually doing this course Socratically, I ask people to tell me, what do you think potential conflicts did Dr. Wilson have? So let's look at that. So what conflicts did he have? Well, as a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, of course, he was most interested in science. But as a stockholder for Genovo, he may have been potentially motivated by the ability of Genovo to turn a profit and for its share price to increase. And that's something you don't want to have to worry about when people's lives are on the line. He has since admitted, there's a fantastic documentary on Netflix called The Gene, and it's inspired by the book by the same title by what's his name, Berti. Anyway, great book, great documentary. Look for it because they talk about this. And Wilson actually sits down for an interview for it, and I was very thrilled to see him take full responsibility for this and understand that he was wrong. And he shouldn't have been in this position. They moved too quickly. The conflicts of interest and his insufficiently disinterested attitude led to a death here and a tragedy. So the repercussions for science were significant. The field of gene therapy was basically put on hold worldwide for more than a year. There was a worldwide call for reviews of these ongoing trials. So it set back the field, and perhaps lives that could have been saved had the field been able to continue as it should have were lost. All of this has repercussions. You know, not just people lost in shipwrecks, but people dying in human subject trials. These are actual lives that are at stake through errors in science if we are not careful about who we are responsible to. So Wilson had too many masters involved in his position. He could have solved this simply. How could he have solved this? Well, one would have been put somebody else in charge of the human subjects trials. You know, he was at a university. He has colleagues there. Those colleagues are perfectly capable of overseeing the human subjects trials. You know, he had already published significantly, created the protocols, had the patents in hand. He could have had somebody who didn't have a financial interest in the results oversee the human subjects trials. The university was responsible for waiving its own conflicts of interest guidelines. So ultimately, the lesson is if you want to avoid the perils of conflicting interests, you have to be mindful that they can occur. You have to know to whom you are responsible, who you are answerable, what your motivations are, and be sure that they're always geared towards the ethos of science. So very quickly, because I know we want to get to a question and answer session, I'm going to just wrap up with IP and data, intellectual property and data. So if you're doing basic research, you're collecting data sets, and those are ordinarily not protectable. So there's no patent or copyright for raw data. There's only patents or copyrights for original expressions of ideas, not for the data itself. And that's been true of science forever, and it's necessary in order for science to proceed the way it does, because you know, the data itself is not your invention, right? It's not your creation. You observe it, you don't develop it. Ideally, you don't develop it. Some of the people on that top 10 list, actually, they did just pull it out of thin air. But data sets are not protectable. Data itself is not your expression. It's not your property, right? It's ultimately it belongs to science as an institution, and it has to be able to be revealed as such. So data accumulated from your scientific studies are observational. It reflects the world that exists. And again, it's not your original expression. You don't own it, and you can't claim rights to that data. In fact, you have to be able to make it available to everybody for checking at some point. You have to be mindful of existing protections on others' expressions. So this overlaps with some of our concerns about attribution. But IP does complicate the research landscape because we also need to be respectful of the fact that some people do own certain ideas when instantiated in some particular art, like a patentable method or machine. So you have to keep an eye on that you're not infringing. Now, there's usually a research exception. So the use of copyrighted and patent data, patented objects or methods, processes is usually accepted for in local patent laws or IP laws. But you have to be careful that that's the case in wherever it is you're doing your research. So the use and misuse of data is a challenge to researchers attempting to abide by the ethos of science. Aside from legal issues such as non-disclosure agreements and privacy concerns, there may be contractual issues that also require you to maintain some secrecy during the course of some study. If your study is funded by some private firm, for instance, it's likely there are non-disclosure agreements. Your lab or your co-researchers may have agreements in place as to how they share data and when. And so we have a ongoing and eternal conflict between openness and secrecy in scientific research. So when is it proper to maintain secrecy? Well, I think in an early stage of a research program, there's very good reasons to be secret about it. Okay, there's always somebody out there trying to scoop you. There's others who trying to get that first publication. I don't think you are under an obligation to reveal what you're doing to your fellow scientists if you want to make the first publication based upon studies you've done that have led you to think you're ready to publish. But that's up to you. Maybe you're more generous than I am. So what happens sometimes is that data sometimes gets hidden or slightly altered, et cetera, manipulated in ways that, again, if they are revealed to have been changed or altered or obfuscated, would damage not only your reputation, but science as a whole. So you shouldn't do that. Don't alter the data. Don't present it poorly or wrongly. And one of the ways this can be done is somehow claiming that you have special rights or restrictions to that data. Actually, there's recently an article about this very problem right now. And major journals are being called to task for this. There's a lot of studies out there for which, published it with the paper, it says, data sets are available on request. But scientists trying to get access to that data are either overlooked, ignored, or turned away. You can't do that. It's not good for science. And this is a real problem now for reproducibility in scientific studies, which is facing, again, another crisis. There's some overly large percentage of scientific studies which are not reproducible, that are published in major journals like Nature and Science. And not having access to the data sets is a real hindrance to our ability to understand why those studies are not reproducible. And again, this undermines the very nature of science itself. So here's a case I like to talk about. Scott Rubin, and actually both of these guys, most of them have similar issues, but let's talk about Scott Rubin. He's a fellow American. He's been called the Bernie Madoff of academia. He was so respected at one time for his work. He taught at Tufts University, a nice university in Boston, had a key position at Bay State Medical Center. But eventually, there was an audit of his research data. And at least some of the data in every one of his 21 articles dating back to 1996 had been falsified. And he kept people from knowing this by a couple of things. One was turning people away when they asked to review the data. and expecting people not to care. Which, as it turns out, you know, there's so much science that's published and so many articles out there that most of those articles don't get seriously critiqued or seriously reviewed once they're published. People expect the peer review process to do that, but it's obviously not functioning properly because falsified data made it into all of his papers, and this is a real. This is, again, a real crisis for science and for publishing. What happens when we let this happen? What happens to the institutions of science? What happens to us as individual researchers when we let this happen? People lose faith in the processes of science, in the veracity of scientific studies, in the good will of researchers. And if they do, then they become susceptible to believing things that are less than scientific. And for instance, not trusting good medical advice or good scientific advice. And we see this again, you know, in the current pandemic, there's distrust of government and scientists about the proper measures and to take for our protection, or about the potentials for treatments or cures. And that's, again, probably costing lives. So I'm going to end with that section. The final section, I'll give you the link again. You can go through it, and I hope you'll take your time. These books are not terribly thick. You're not going to spend too long reading them, but they offer more cases and more examples, all of which I think I'll have to update soon, because every day there's more topical examples. And I'm sure there's a whole book or two that will come out of the COVID crisis relating to many of these issues. But I'm going to stop there, not only because I'm losing my voice, I'm not used to lecturing, but because I want to take questions.
Thank you very much, David, for that lecture and all of those examples. We do have questions from our students. The first one is from the field of biology, and our student asks, she indicates that she has a lot of her lab mates as well as local guides have helped her in her fieldwork, to do her fieldwork, and she would have definitely not been able to complete her work without their help. How can she fairly decide if it is pertinent to include them as authors? And we have a follow-up question from another student who asks a similar question and wonders how to decide who should be included as co-author and who should simply be mentioned in the acknowledgements.
Yeah, again, this was a question I didn't get 20 years ago when I started teaching this, but now I get every time. It's always the first question: who counts as an author? Again, I think the problem is people are looking at their H indices and worried about having as many publications as possible. And it's a perfectly legitimate concern. It's necessary to publish in order to have a healthy career in academia. But for both of those questioners, I would suggest making sure, firstly, that they've read the paper, that they are comfortable with what's in the paper, that they have contributed in some way, even if it's, even a discussion about the substance of the study can be sufficient if it is somehow guidance for the paper itself, not just an offhanded discussion about, what did you think of the paper? But if they're contributing in some way, that they're comfortable, that you're comfortable naming them as an author, and that they're comfortable taking any responsibility for things that could go wrong with the study. That's the measure I suggest. Mm-hmm. There's no, as I said, there's no etched in stone guiding rule about this.
And in the case specifically of field work, they mention local guides or lab partners who have helped them access the field. Would these people be considered co-authors?
Again, you need to involve them in the ideas somehow. not just in data gathering, because you can do a lot of data gathering without having any input to the ideas. If they are to be named an author, the best rule of thumb, I think, is to make sure they're engaged with the ideas that make it into the paper. And again, reading the full paper, providing some comments, and then being willing to take responsibility. There are, often people put acknowledgements in books and papers. And that's a really nice thing to do for people who are helping in some way that haven't met that threshold that I suggest. And it's really, a suggestion on my part, because I don't want to get you in trouble with people who you are answerable to. But I also don't want them to get in trouble with science itself, right? If something goes wrong, we don't want to cause real problems in science by taking some benefit without being sufficiently responsible. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
I know it's
Absolutely.
vague, but this is ethics.
You mentioned hierarchy earlier, and one of our questions speaks to this issue. One of our students tells the story of one of her friends who wrote a paper based on her thesis and submitted it to her journal as first author. However, her tutor and lab collaborators, she changed to a different lab, and her new tutor told her that it should be submitted to a different journal because it would be faster. She wasn't convinced, but then her tutor stopped answering her emails. And months later, she saw that the article had already been published in another journal with her tutor as first author rather than herself. What can be done in these cases, and how can it be prevented?
Okay, well, there is an ombudsman, usually for faculties who can deal with those situations. There should be. One of the things I was working at the postgrado was setting up a regularized system of dealing with academic issues like that. And that is an issue. That's a significant issue. If that paper was written by one person and then published by another as first author, that doesn't solve the problem by putting them on the author list. That's, if you are the author of the paper, you should be the one that is dealing with the journal while it's going through the publication process. You need to go to whoever your ombudsman is for your faculty. You can go to, hopefully it's not too difficult for you to go to your chair if necessary. The chair can refer you to the proper committee for dealing with that, but that needs to be taken care of. And I know it's very difficult. Personally, it's scary to deal with. But if we let these things perpetuate, then it doesn't fix the problems in science that can result. If that person took responsibility as first author and something is found to be wrong with that paper, and you're not involved in that process, then they have exposed you to harms as well, has taken on the potential for harms themselves.
Thank you. The following question is about data. What would you do if the tutor gives you data from a previous student that cannot be verified by you, or that your tutor gives someone else your data when you leave the lab?
Yeah, so you don't own the data. That, as we said, there's no rights to it. So certainly there's no problem with them sharing the data that's generated in their lab by you through a study that was done while you're working in that lab. There should be, however, appropriate documentation about how that data was retrieved, how it was collated, how it was analyzed. So, there's another case which I didn't mention. I could talk cases all day, but it really goes to the proper custodial arrangements about lab notebooks and lab data, and keeping very detailed records about how that data was acquired and how it was maintained, so that it could be reproduced. If there's no way to verify the data, that means that data wasn't properly, the custodial arrangement wasn't proper, and it's a real problem, because if you're representing this data as true and you don't know that it's true, that can reflect poorly upon you as a scientist, and it can again break this chain of truth we've talked about. So you would probably be best to try to recreate the data from scratch, do the observations again, if you can't verify where they came from or how they were made. And the case that I often mention in this situation is the one of Robert Millikan, who's a Nobel Prize winner, who did a very essential study in physics about the charge of electrons. And he got a Nobel Prize for this work, and he worked with another. It was the scientific question was, do electrons have a unitary charge, or is there some sort of spectrum of charges? No, does it have a different charge based on different factors? And he came to the right conclusion. But as it turns out, he probably came to that conclusion with insufficient evidence, because later on, after he was dead and after he'd already gotten his Nobel Prize, his lab notebooks were found, and there were all sorts of, he crossed out data he didn't want to use. He put notes in there, don't use these observations, etc. And he beat out another guy who had the wrong theory, but who had kept detailed, meticulous notes, and we could always reproduce those studies. But there was a lot of trouble in reproducing Millikan studies, and there were people who were complaining that this guy's getting a Nobel Prize and we can't really reproduce these studies. And as it turns out, the note-taking and probably the apparatus he was using was 10 years too early before to actually come to a solid conclusion. So my advice in short is keep your own data well maintained. Make sure there's a clear trail back for whoever comes in next to use that data, and don't use data that you can't verify.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Our following question has to do with conflict of interest, but not in terms of resources or many masters, but rather in terms of a conflict of interest with a reviewer. The student asks, how can I get out of a vicious circle in which one reviewer evidently has a conflict of interest with my submitted paper and keeps rejecting it and asking for changes, while the rest of the reviewers have long before accepted the article? Should I write to the editor-in-chief?
Yeah, the dreaded reviewer too. So, all of us are familiar with that. You get one review that's, just publish almost as is, or, minor changes, and then the other reviewer says, how could a person write this? So yeah, some people have a specific issue with a specific paper, and you absolutely should write to the editor of the journal and ask for a different reviewer. That you're within your rights to do so. They can say no. They have, that it's their journal. They can choose not to have any additional process. But yeah, most editors are pretty open to the idea of making sure another reviewer is available, and see that there's no bias or personal animosity or jealousy, which also gets in the way sometimes of publishing of data of articles.
Thank you. The following question is regarding plagiarism. One common instance of plagiarism that I see as a translator copy editor is that some of the cited material is translated 2 or 3 times and then used as original material. For instance, someone takes a paragraph originally written in English that has been translated into Spanish and then back into English. So due to the little changes that occur in the translation process, it is harder to be traced as plagiarism. And what happens if you are citing this in good faith?
Yeah, so it's getting, this is becoming more common because more papers are becoming translated, and tools for translation are abounding. But it's really up to you to trace back all of your references and make sure you're using an original source and finding that original source. And there's a lot of tools that help you to do that. Many more than when I was a graduate student. You can use Google Scholar pretty efficiently to check your citations, and it's an excellent place to start. But in your own field, there are indices and experts who can help you to trace back to the original sources. I was told since I was a high school student, always cite to the primary source. The David Davies Bonwick case I gave you is a really good example because, David Davies was passing himself off as an ethnographer of an extinct people and offering quotes from those people without reference to the original source, which of course is suspect. And you don't want to end up like that. You want to be sure you're finding that original source if possible. So find it in the original language, get somebody who can help you translate it properly. And if you can't, then find something else to use as your reference.
Thank you.
I hope that's helpful. I'm not always sure I've actually answered the question. If I haven't, please let me know, because sometimes I go off on tangents.
No, that was brilliant. We have another question going back to this idea of authorship, which, as you say, is something that seems to worry our students a lot. This is a question indicating one researcher who has been included in an article as a co-author, but his contribution was only to allow the use of equipment. Very often, this is a previously stated agreement. And what should one do in this case? Should it be reported as a conflict of interest? Or even if they were present at the beginning of the process, but then disappeared for the rest of it?
Right. Again, this varies. One thing I didn't really talk about was how this varies from field to field. So first of all, I don't think that's a good idea just from a scientific perspective, because if something is, let's suppose there's something false in the paper, not that the person asking me the question would have done it, but possibly erroneous. And the person who wants to be named because their equipment was used doesn't know much about the study because they haven't reviewed it or asked questions about it or contributed to it. They're taking a tremendous risk upon themselves. Because if it's retracted at some point or worse, then they're taking on that responsibility too, which will harm them as well as the authors. My suggestion is reflect upon the common practices in your field first. Make sure that you're not being asked to do something that's outside of the realm of common practice in your field. Be sure that you're willing to deal with any repercussions of raising the issue with people in your field, and that you're comfortable with pursuing it further, because I don't want to get anyone in trouble in their hierarchies, which do exist. But then, yeah, I would certainly first talk to that person, make sure they're willing to take responsibility for what's in the paper, and suggest to them that they read it and provide commentary. And as well, I would suggest, if they insist on being named after they fail to do that, if they fail to do that, that you discuss it with, again, a chair or somebody in authority in the department who can give you guidance and point you to the right person. Again, if it's not within the standard practices of your field department or your colleagues' expectations. Again, and if there's a problem with it and you don't want to be associated with it, you're under no obligation to publish your paper, which is also an option. You shouldn't be forced into a position of publishing something in which you feel ethically responsible for things that you don't want to be responsible for.
Well, that actually leads into one of our other questions, which is, would you consider it as an ethical misconduct not to publish the results of your research?
No, it might be the most ethical thing to do. I mean, listen, there's so many publications in science that there's a good chance that, you know, a fair number of them are inconsequential. Okay, we don't have to publish everything. And often scientists are faced with the question of, oh, well, you know, there's existing institutions like tenure reviews, et cetera, SNE reviews, things like that, that put pressure on us to have a certain number of publications every year. But it may be in the particular year, you haven't got anything that's consequential. Should we be publishing things that are not consequential? This is a problem in science right now. Again, one of the many crises faced by scientific publishing, often called salami science, where people take a study, slice it up into thin slices, you know, the thinnest possible slice, right, to get some publication out. In terms of whether that's good for science, I think the obvious answer is no. It's not. It's a time-consuming process to review papers. It consumes most of, you know, it consumes a lot of time for us to be on editorial boards and to have to do the peer review process that we don't get paid for. And if we're reading things that are not ultimately consequential, that's taking up valuable time away from the primary studies we're involved in as well. So yeah, it might be most ethical thing to do to wait or not publish. If you have I mean, negative results are sometimes published and they can be valuable, you know, if it contributes to the field. But not in every case, and you have to gauge whether or not it's worth everyone's time.
Right, absolutely. Yes, thank you. The following question has to do again with hierarchy and the position that students may be in when having to perhaps take risks in order to point out ethical issues. What happens when writing is part of your job profile, as in the case of an intern or a research assistant? Many interns end up doing the research for and writing academic articles for their researcher bosses, and they, in a way, ghostwrite. However, they do not get credit for this, and when they ask for credit, are usually labeled as difficult and are let go.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of any way in which this could be managed?
Again, that's not ethical. You know, to do someone else's work, unless that's part of your contract. So there are contract writers, you know, who will write things for you. But that's usually not in academia. And again, it breaks this chain of knowledge and responsibility. So if it turns out that you are ghostwriting essentially for somebody who then takes the benefit of being the first author, that's something you need to broach with your department head or with others within that hierarchy responsible for hearing ethics complaints, because that's abusive.
Yes, indeed it is. Thank you. This question is as a result of your presentation earlier in terms of co-authorship and responsibility. I read, my instructor has sent a paper with my data to a journal, and even though he put me as an author, he didn't consult me. At first I was happy, but now I wonder what I should do. Should I talk to the journal and tell them that I am not familiar with the paper?
Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea. I would suggest that if your name is attributed to something with which you're not familiar, that exposes you. The journal is happy to do a correction and remove you from the authorship if you're not happy to be an author. Yeah, absolutely. That's not good practice at all.
Great. So in general, I believe what we're hearing is ideally for students or people who are hired to do this work as assistant, it would be good to have a committee or someone that one could speak to in order to avoid jeopardizing one's own position as a student within an emerging field and the networks that we are trying to establish.
Yeah. If there isn't an existing such committee in your department or faculty, you may look to the university, which has, I think, a committee for ethics, and ask for their advice. But I think more people need to become familiar with all those processes. And it's a different class, but we could give you some guidance about the specific mechanisms available for helping with these issues. I'm just a professor of ethics. I'm not in charge of the mechanisms, and I don't really know how they all function there.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. We've reached the end of our session. It has been, I believe, extremely helpful and eye-opening, because the ethical issues are not considered often when we talk about researching and publication. And we firmly believe that it is important to begin talking about these things, especially among students who are unaware of what issues may arise during their careers as academics. So I thank you, David, for speaking to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to our viewers and to our students. We welcome you to visit our website and our Facebook page and follow all our information, and to write to us if you have any further questions.